Alina heard the agreement being sealed before she reached the bottom stair. The sound came through the drawing-room door, the distinct, cheerful ring of two crystal glasses touching together in celebration, and it reached her halfway down the staircase, where she had paused with one hand on the dark oak banister, her mind still half caught in the legal text she had been reading for the past hour in secret. She knew every sound this house made. She had grown up learning the difference between her father pouring himself an evening drink alone and her father sealing a deal with another man over the thing he valued most, which was not principle but convenience. This was the second kind. His voice came through the heavy door warm and relieved in a way she had not heard in nearly 2 years. "Excellent, then we are fully agreed. October it shall be." The reply was calm, measured, unhurried, and belonged to a voice she had never heard before. "October suits me well, Lord Whitmore. I prefer a quiet ceremony, nothing that requires a great deal of arrangement on either side." Alina stood on the staircase and felt the floor shift beneath her feet without moving at all. October, a quiet ceremony, nothing requiring great arrangement on either side, as though they were scheduling the delivery of furniture. She pressed her back against the wall and breathed, 3 long deliberate breaths. Her mind began working before the shock had fully resolved itself into feeling, which was how her mind always operated when something serious arrived. She counted what she knew. Her father was in debt. She had understood this for 2 years and confirmed it herself by reading the household accounts he had left carelessly on his study desk one winter afternoon when he believed everyone was at church. She had done the arithmetic. She had watched the creditor's letters accumulate on the silver tray in the hall. She had seen the precise, anxious way he opened the post each morning. She had suspected for several months that something was being arranged. She had not known until this exact moment that the arrangement was already complete, past tense, sealed, done without a word to her. She moved down the last 3 stairs. She stood in the hallway for a moment. She thought about what it would mean to turn around and go back upstairs. Then she walked to the drawing-room door, turned the handle and stepped inside. Her father was on his feet before she had fully crossed the threshold. He always rose slowly, the deliberate, unhurried movement of a man entirely comfortable in his own authority. Tonight he was standing before she had even finished opening the door, and the speed of it told her everything about the precise measure of his guilt. He smiled with the wideness of a man who has already decided to be very confident about something he knows was wrong. "Alina, good, come in. There is someone I very much want you to meet." The man who rose from the chair across the fireplace was tall. He was perhaps 50, perhaps a year or 2 beyond, with silver hair and the kind of posture that belongs to men who have never once slumped under any weight, physical or otherwise. His face was lean and composed. His eyes were pale gray, and they moved to Alina the moment she entered the room, taking in the whole of her with quiet, thorough efficiency, the way a person reviews a document they have been handed to check its details against expectations. It was not an unkind look. It was a comprehensive one. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and inclined his head. "Edmund Cavendish." Alina looked at him, then at her father, then back at the Duke of Ashford. She kept her voice level and her face composed, which required considerably more effort than it appeared to. "How do you do?" she said. Because in a warm drawing-room with 2 men standing in the firelight having just clinked their glasses over the arrangement of her life, there was nothing else to say that would not expose the full interior of what she was thinking. Dinner that evening was the most sustained performance Alina had ever given, and she had been performing the correct Miss Whitmore at difficult dinners since she was 16 years old. Her mother, Lady Margaret, sat at her usual place and brought 20 years of practiced social warmth to bear with impressive precision. She smiled at the Duke. She inquired about his journey from London, his estates in Derbyshire, his opinion of the recent harvest season. She kept the conversation moving with the smooth, careful attention of a woman who had spent 2 decades making difficult evenings feel pleasant, and had decided this was her primary contribution to the world. Alina watched her mother work and understood, not for the first time, that Lady Margaret's cheerfulness was the most sophisticated piece of self-defense she had ever witnessed at close range. Her mother had built her survival on being indispensable to the comfort of the room. Alina had built hers on something else entirely. Clara sat 2 chairs from Alina and kept glancing at her across the table with wide, dark eyes that were doing a great deal of work. Clara was 19 years old and quick-minded, and had spent her entire life learning to read Alina's face the way most people learn to read the weather. She was reading it tonight, and she was not liking what she found, and the effort of keeping her face pleasant over whatever she was feeling was visible in the small tension around her jaw. Edmund Cavendish ate with controlled manners and spoke with measured precision. He was not unpleasant. He was not loud or self-important or dismissive. He discussed the state of land taxation, the extension of a northern railway line, and the difficulty of maintaining older stone structures through English winters. He was, by any fair assessment, a competent dinner companion. But Elinor, who had trained herself over years to listen carefully to what was present in a conversation and also to what was absent, noticed one thing with complete clarity. In the entire 2 hours of dinner, he did not ask her a single question. He directed remarks to her regularly. He acknowledged her presence. He made comments that invited her to respond. But not once did he ask what she thought, what she preferred, or what she wanted from any part of the future being arranged around her. He spoke to her the way a person speaks to a settled fact. Lord Aldrich ate with the visible relief of a man who has been drowning quietly for months and has just felt solid ground under his feet. He refilled the Duke's wine glass twice, unprompted. He laughed at his own remarks with more energy than they warranted. He was performing the role of a grateful host without any particular restraint, and Elinor watched him across the table and thought about the years she had spent trying to understand her father, and how much of him, in the end, was simply legible. When dinner ended, and the gentlemen withdrew to the study for whatever further conversations required conducting, Elinor excused herself from the parlor with the explanation of a headache. Lady Margaret accepted this without the slightest doubt. Clara watched her leave with an expression that said clearly she knew it was not a headache, and that she intended to say so at the first private opportunity. Elinor went out through the side door and stood in the cold, dark garden for a long time. Her breath came out in small white shapes in the autumn chill. She walked the gravel path between the dormant rose bushes and thought with the methodical, unhurried focus she reserved for serious problems. She was 22 years old. She had no income and no independent property. She had read enough law in secret, borrowed from her brother's shelves and from the periodicals in Dr. Hobbs' waiting room, to understand with complete precision what the law provided for a woman in her position. Almost nothing. A woman whose father had agreed to an arrangement on her behalf had no legal mechanism to refuse it. She had read this carefully, hoping to find an ambiguity. There was none. Running was possible and dangerous. Women who ran were found. The world was arranged to find them. A woman traveling alone without money or a reliable destination was a woman easily retrieved, and retrieval was always worse than the original situation because now there was also the matter of disobedience to account for, on top of everything else. So she was not going to run. She stood in the garden and let her mind work through the shape of the problem without rushing it. The problem was structural. Elinor Whitmore existed within a legal and social framework built over centuries to remove women's choices by design. She had a name, a family connection, a legal identity, a home address. She could be found, identified, and returned to any situation she escaped from, as long as she continued to be the person those records described. Unless she was no longer that person. The idea arrived quietly, the way serious ideas usually do, not as a sudden flash, but as a patient observation that had been waiting for her to be still enough to hear it. She held it and turned it carefully and looked at its edges without rushing toward any conclusion. A dead woman had no obligations. A dead woman could not be married or retrieved or returned. A dead woman was, in every practical sense, beyond the reach of what was coming for Elinor Whitmore. She owed nothing to no one. She existed, in the eyes of all applicable law, not at all. The legal framework that had been built to contain her had no mechanism for containing someone it believed no longer existed. Elinor stood in the cold garden with this thought for a long time. The risks were real and the difficulties were enormous, and she did not minimize either. She held them against the alternative, which was October and a quiet ceremony, and nothing requiring great arrangement on either side. She went back inside. She went to the servants' corridor at the back of the house and knocked softly on the door at the end of it. Dorothea Price opened the door at once. She had clearly not been sleeping, which Elinor had expected. Dorothea took one look at her face, stepped back, and let her in without a word. Elinor sat on the edge of the narrow bed and told Dorothea everything. She spoke plainly, without embellishment or self-pity, from the sound of the glasses on the staircase to the walk in the garden and the thought she had arrived at in the cold. She told it all in sequence and left nothing out. Dorothea listened with her hands folded and her eyes steady and did not make a sound. When Alina finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Dorothea said, "What are you going to do?" Alina said, "I do not have the complete plan yet, but I know its shape. I need two things. I need your help and I need to speak to Dr. Hobb." Dorothea was quiet, then she said, "How much risk, how far does this go?" "I cannot know the full scope until I have spoken with him," Alina said honestly. "But I will tell you the truth. It will not be a small thing. I would not ask you for something small." Dorothea looked at her for a long moment. She had been in this house for 10 years. She had watched Alina grow up, watched her read in corners and ask questions nobody wanted to answer and quietly build an interior life the Whitmore household had largely ignored because acknowledging it was inconvenient. She knew what this family had given Alina and what it had withheld from her. The list of the second was considerably longer than the list of the first. "You tell me what you need from me," Dorothea said, "and I will do it." Alina pressed her hand briefly, which was about as much of an open expression of gratitude as she ever allowed herself, and which Dorothea understood as the significant thing it was. She returned to her room. She lit one candle and opened the journal she kept hidden inside the spine of a large and dull volume about land drainage, wedged between her brother's old agricultural texts on the lower shelf. She turned to a blank page and wrote at the top, "What I need." Below that she listed 6 things: money, a physician, a trusted hand, a destination, a new name, and time. She studied the list. Then she turned to the facing page and wrote, "What I have." Below that she wrote, £43 saved over 3 years sewn into the lining of my winter coat. Dorothea, the possibility of Dr. Hobb, the ability to think clearly when it matters most, and the willingness to go as far as this requires. She looked at the second list for a long time. It was shorter than the first, but it was not nothing. She had built from less before. Over the following days, the engagement moved with a speed that felt calculated to prevent clear thinking. Invitations went out to the county families. A dressmaker was summoned and arrived the following Tuesday with 3 assistants and a quantity of fabric samples. Lady Margaret began discussing the October ceremony with the enthusiasm of a woman who has been waiting years for something to celebrate, and Lord Aldrich moved through the house with a lightness Alina had not seen in him since before the debts became unmanageable. Clara found Alina alone in the library on the second evening and closed the door behind her and said, quietly and without preamble, "Tell me what is happening." Alina looked at her sister. Clara had always been perceptive and she had always been honest about what she perceived, 2 qualities Alina had always loved in her and which were, at this particular moment, extremely difficult to navigate. "Nothing is happening that you don't know about," Alina said. "The engagement has been announced." "That is not what I mean," Clara said. "I mean what is happening inside you, because you look like someone who has already made a decision about something." Alina looked at her for a moment, then she said, "I am managing it, I promise you I am managing it." Clara looked at her for a long moment. She was not satisfied by this answer. She was not supposed to be, but she accepted it in the way that Clara always accepted the things Alina would not say, which was with a patience and a watchfulness that Alina had always counted as one of her sister's great gifts. "All right," Clara said, "but you will tell me." "I will tell you," Alina said, which was true in the sense that she intended to eventually when telling was possible. Edmund Cavendish called each morning. He and Alina walked the garden paths in what had become their established daily hour of acquaintance. He spoke about the Ashford Library with the quiet pride of a man who had built it himself over 20 years. Several thousand volumes, organized by subject and period. Alina asked what subjects were most heavily represented. He said history, philosophy, estate management, and military history. She asked, without any particular inflection, whether there was law. He looked at her with a brief, unreadable pause. "Some law," he said, "not the most extensive section." She nodded pleasantly and moved the conversation elsewhere, but she had noted the pause. She filed it the way she filed everything she did not immediately understand. On the 4th day of his visit, on the longer path behind the rose garden, he stopped walking. He turned to look at her with something more direct than his usual composed manner. "You are not happy about this arrangement," he said, not a question. Alina kept her voice steady. "I was not consulted about the arrangement," she said. "There is a difference between those 2 things." He was quiet. He nodded once slowly, acknowledging a point that could not be disputed. Then he offered her his arm and they walked back to the house in silence, and he said nothing further about it. She thought about that exchange for the rest of the day and part of the night. She could not determine whether it was the behavior of a man who understood and was unmoved, or the behavior of a man who understood and did not yet know what to do with that understanding. She decided, after sufficient consideration, that it did not matter. Either way, October was still coming. She sent a note through the milk girl the following morning, addressed to Dr. Elias Hobb, saying only that she needed a private consultation on a matter of urgent personal importance, and asking whether he could receive her on Thursday at 8 o'clock through the side entrance, before his morning surgeries began. The reply came back that afternoon, Thursday, 8 o'clock. Alina folded it and placed it inside the drainage book. At the engagement dinner her father arranged for the county families that same week, she wore the correct dress, said the correct things, and smiled at the correct moments. She watched Edmund Cavendish across the candlelit room as he moved through the assembled county families with the contained, self-possessed ease of a man who has never found social situations particularly demanding. She watched him speak with the vicar and with old Colonel Whitfield and with young Mrs. Parish and with her father, and she observed, with the detached attention she brought to everything worth observing, that he was not performing any of it. He was simply present, which was different, and which was a quality she had not expected and did not know what to do with at this precise moment in her planning. She went home and opened her journal and looked at the 2 lists she had written. Then she turned to a new page and wrote in very small, careful handwriting the beginning of an outline, not a plan yet, an outline of a direction which was the most important thing. Everything else could be built from a direction, step by careful step, if you were patient and clear-eyed and willing to go exactly as far as the situation required. She intended to go precisely that far. Dr. Hobb opened the side door of his surgery at 8 o'clock on Thursday morning before Alina had finished knocking. He had been awake since well before 5. She could tell by the particular quality of alertness in him, not anxious but deeply awake, the state of someone who has been sitting in a quiet room doing serious thinking for several hours, and is now ready to receive what he has been thinking toward. He led her through the cold corridor to his consulting room, where the fire had been built up and 2 cups of tea were already on the small table. The curtains were drawn, the lamp was low. He had been expecting this conversation for days and had prepared the room for it, which told Alina what she had hoped to know, that he had not spent the interval since her note deciding whether to engage with whatever she brought him, but had instead spent it preparing to engage with it seriously. He was a man who prepared for things. "Tell me all of it," he said, sitting across the desk from her. "From the beginning, leave nothing out." She told him. She spoke the way she always spoke about serious matters, clearly, without softening, without searching for comfortable phrasings for uncomfortable facts. She described the arrangement her father had made, the dinner, the cold garden, what she had concluded standing in the dark. She described what she needed from him specifically, and why she believed he was the only person in a position to provide it. She told him about Dorothea and about Leonard Cole, and about the £43 in the coat lining, and about Edinburgh and Agnes Fenn's boarding house, and the Suffrage Society's post box through which preliminary contact had already been made. She told him all of it, in order, without leaving anything out, because she needed him to understand the full scope of what she was proposing before he gave her any answer. He listened without moving. When she finished, he was quiet. The cold morning light was beginning to reach the tops of the hedgerows outside. A horse moved on the road beyond the window. The fire made a small sound in the grate. "The death certificate is the most dangerous element," he said at last. "It is a legal document. The wording must be completely consistent with the symptoms displayed, and the progression of those symptoms must follow a pattern that is credible for the illness described. I cannot sign a certificate for a cause of death that contradicts what the household has observed, and I cannot sign one for a progression that does not align with the medical reality of that illness. It must hold up to any reading, by any physician who might review it after the fact." "I understand that," Alina said. "I have thought about which illness is most credible for the purpose. A rapid fever with respiratory involvement, the kind that is associated with chest illness in young women and that moves quickly, leaving little time for a secondary consultation. I can display the correct early signs in a convincing sequence. I have been reading medical literature for the past 3 years whenever I had access to it. I understand the basic progression." He looked at her with the expression he occasionally wore when she said something that confirmed a quality he had suspected, but had not yet had occasion to fully observe. "You have been reading medical literature." I have been reading everything that seemed potentially useful for the past 3 years, Elinor said. I did not know what form the contingency would take. I prepared for the range of possibilities. And the body, he said quietly, you have thought about the body. Leonard Cole, Elinor said, the undertaker's assistant at the Frome practice. I have assessed his character at 2 separate social occasions and found him practical, financially motivated, and without particular loyalty to anyone in this district. The amount I can offer him is £12. I have already had a preliminary conversation with him that confirmed he is open to the proposition. He knows what you are planning. He knows that I will require a specific arrangement regarding the coffin and the burial, Elinor said. Not the full picture, but enough to confirm that he will cooperate for £12 in permanent silence. Dr. Hobb looked at her for a long moment. You have spoken to him without knowing whether I would agree, he said. I had to assess the risk before I could assess the plan, Elinor said. I would not have been able to tell you honestly whether the plan was feasible without knowing that element was possible. He considered this. That is a reasonable position, he said. He picked up his tea and held it and looked at the surface of his desk and was quiet for perhaps 30 seconds. Elinor waited. She had learned over the years that the most effective thing you could do with a silence that was doing important work was to leave it alone. I need until Saturday, he said finally. I need to work through the specific wording of the certificate and the precise sequence of symptoms that must be displayed. I also need to think carefully about the period of concealment and what the seller can realistically provide in terms of safety and comfort over a period of up to 12 days. Come back on Saturday at the same time. Elinor came back on Saturday. His answer was yes. They spent 3 hours that morning planning with the same methodical attention they each brought to their respective work, which meant that nothing was assumed and nothing was accepted simply because it was easier than questioning it. Dr. Hobb pushed back on 3 of her assumptions and identified 2 points of genuine vulnerability that Elinor had not fully considered. They adjusted. When they finished, the plan had been tested against itself and had held. The illness would begin on the 14th of March, which gave them 6 weeks. The symptoms would be a rapid fever with accompanying difficulty breathing, the kind associated with a chest illness in young women. Elinor would begin showing early signs on the first 2 days, with Dorothea amplifying the alarm in her reports to Lady Margaret. Dr. Hobb would be called on the 3rd day and would manage the household's understanding of the progression from that point forward. The move from the house to the surgery cellar would happen on the night of the 5th day, when the household was fully engaged in its grief, and the logistical question of Elinor's continued presence in her room became unsustainable. The death certificate would be signed on the 6th day. Leonard Cole would do his work in the 36 hours following. After the Saturday meeting, Elinor met Leonard Cole at the Frome Parish Market on a Wednesday in the 2nd week of preparation. She chose the market for its noise and its crowd, and because she had legitimate reason to be there, which meant her presence near the livestock pens where Leonard Cole was conducting his rounds required no explanation. She walked with him to the far corner of the market, where the sounds of the animals provided a continuous background. She told him what she needed. She was direct and factual. She did not appeal to his sympathies or to any abstract principle. She presented it as a business arrangement between 2 people who each had something the other needed, and she described his role specifically. The management of the coffin situation in the period between the death certificate and the burial, and permanent silence about the arrangement from that day forward, under all circumstances, forever. He listened with the flat, unhurried attention of someone accustomed to receiving information that other people prefer not to say aloud. £15, he said. 10, Elinor said. 12, he said. She agreed to 12. He nodded once. She walked to the next stall and bought 2 bundles of parsley as though nothing significant had just occurred. The 6 weeks that followed were the most demanding of Elinor's life to that point, not because of the planning, which she managed with systematic precision, but because of the performance. She had to be Miss Whitmore every single day. She had to walk in the garden with Edmund Cavendish each morning and discuss libraries and estates as though October were a date she anticipated rather than counted down away from. She had to sit at dinner and attend small county events and stand at the drawing-room fire and make the correct conversation. She had to do all of this while carrying the full weight of what she was building in the hours when no one could see her. Edmund was not making the performance easier. He was more observant than she had initially calculated. In the third week of his visits, during their morning walk, he asked without preamble what precisely she studied in law, whether the history of it or the application of it. The question arrived without warning and with genuine interest. She told him the application interested her more, that the history illuminated it but did not substitute for it. He was quiet for a moment and then said it was an unusual interest for someone in her position. She said yes and did not elaborate. He looked at her with something she could not name easily and said nothing further. She thought about that exchange for 3 days. In the 5th week, a package arrived from London addressed to Miss E. Whitmore. It contained a small, beautifully bound volume of essays on legal philosophy by a Scottish jurist, published 30 years earlier and out of print. The accompanying card said only, "For the Ashford Library, which is, it appears, understocked in law." Elinor sat with the book in her hands for a long time. She turned it over and opened it to the first page and read the first paragraph. Then she set it on the shelf. She did not allow herself to think carefully about what it meant or about the quality of attention it represented. The plan was in position. Every element was confirmed. She could not afford to allow anything to complicate her thinking at this stage. She set the book on the shelf and went back to her preparations. Dorothea had spent 2 weeks learning the coded letter system they had built together. Flower names for every person who mattered. Elinor was always the violet, which Clara would eventually understand. Numbers embedded in ordinary sentences for dates and locations. Dorothea was intelligent and precise, and absorbed the code with the steady efficiency she brought to every task. At Elinor's request, she had also made contact, through the Women's Advocacy Society post box, with Agnes Fenn's boarding house in Edinburgh, confirming the availability of a room in March for a Miss Ellie Worth, arriving with a letter of introduction from a retired Glasgow physician. Dr. Hobb had prepared the letter under the name of a genuine but long-retired colleague who had no connection to any of it. The escape bundle under the loose floorboard beside Elinor's fireplace had been assembled over 3 separate evenings. The money in its coat lining, the journal, a change of clothing, the scissors, the pressed violet from the frame on her wall wrapped in cotton. She looked at the book of legal philosophy on the shelf every evening when she lit her candle and every morning when she extinguished it. She did not put it in the bundle. She left it where it was. Clara had been watching Elinor throughout the engagement period with the specific attention of someone who can see that something is wrong but cannot identify what it is. She came to Elinor's room twice in the evenings and sat on the bed and talked about nothing in particular, which was her method of saying I am here and I am watching and I will wait. Elinor had been warm and present and had said nothing beyond what she could say. She had watched Clara's face when Clara was not looking at her and had filed those images away to carry forward into whatever came next. On the evening of the 13th of March, Elinor sat at her desk and looked around the room she had slept in for 22 years. The books, the lamp, the pressed flowers in the glass frame that Clara had given her for her 17th birthday. She let herself feel all of it without managing any of it. Then she took one violet from the frame and pressed it onto her pillow. It was the only message she could leave that had any chance of eventually being understood. It was not enough, and she knew it, and she was doing it anyway because it was what she had. She went to bed. The following morning she did not come down for breakfast. Dorothea brought the breakfast tray to Elinor's room at 7:30 and found her sitting up in bed with her arms around her knees and her face the color of old candle wax. The effect had been achieved the previous evening using a small amount of chalk powder dissolved in cold water and applied with a cloth to her cheeks and forehead. The result was convincing enough that even Dorothea, who knew exactly what she was looking at, felt a momentary unease when she first came through the door. "I don't think I can eat anything this morning," Elinor said. She kept her voice smaller than usual, slightly thin, the way voices sound when the body is directing its energy elsewhere. Dorothea set down the tray with a care that was slightly more attentive than the occasion required. Their eyes met for one clear, deliberate moment. Everything that needed to pass between them passed in that second. Then Dorothea picked the tray back up and took it downstairs. Lady Margaret came to the room at 8 o'clock, put her hand on Elinor's forehead, and said she did feel rather warm and that Elinor should stay in bed and not worry about the morning walk with the Duke. She spoke with the brisk concern of a woman who prefers manageable problems, and a daughter with a slight temperature was a manageable problem with a clear solution: rest. Lord Aldrich came to the door at 10 o'clock and asked through it whether Elinor needed anything. She said she didn't, thank you, only rest. He sounded relieved. A brief indisposition was simple. He had been living without simple problems for so long that even this one felt almost welcome. A note was sent to Edmund Cavendish explaining that Miss Elinor had taken a slight indisposition. His reply came back within the hour, a short and correctly worded expression of concern, with the hope that she would recover quickly. Elena heard Dorothea read it aloud to Lady Margaret in the corridor, and filed the words without letting herself analyze them. On the second day she did not come down at all. Dorothea carried meals upstairs and removed them largely untouched. The chalk powder had been discontinued. Real sleeplessness had taken over. Elena had not slept well for 2 nights, which she had expected and even planned for, and the genuine tiredness in her face was more convincing than any preparation could have managed. When Lady Margaret looked in on her that afternoon, she came away from the door looking more concerned than she had that morning. On the third day, Dorothea told Lady Margaret at breakfast that Miss Elena had been up twice in the night, that her breathing seemed labored, and that she was frightened. Lady Margaret sent for Dr. Hobb before noon. He arrived at 2 in the afternoon and spent 35 minutes in Elena's room with the door closed. He conducted a genuine examination first, because he was a careful physician and could not afford to sign a death certificate for an illness that a subsequent examination might contradict. Elena was physically well as expected. He briefed her quietly on the next 3 days, what each of them would require from her and from him. He told her what he had prepared in the cellar. He told her when the move would happen. Then he sat with her for a few minutes, and he asked without any particular formality whether she was still certain. Yes, Elena said. He nodded. He said nothing further about it. He came out of the room with the grave, measured expression of a physician managing a difficult situation. He spoke to Lord Aldrich and Lady Margaret in the corridor. He said the fever had progressed to a stage that warranted careful watching. He said it was the kind of illness that moved unpredictably in young women, and that quiet and complete rest were essential. He would return each morning. The household should not be alarmed but should be attentive. He said it with the professional gravity of 15 years of this family's trust, and they received it with exactly the trust he had expected. Lord Aldrich sent a second note to Edmund Cavendish that afternoon. This one said the indisposition had proved to be a fever, and that the family was hopeful of a quick recovery, but that the morning visits would need to continue to be suspended for the time being. Elena heard this noted aloud in the corridor and lay in the dark, and did not think about the Duke's reply. Elena lay in her room and listened to the house. She had not anticipated how much of the house she would be able to hear from the bed. The old walls carried sound in ways she had never fully noticed from the perspective of movement. From stillness she could hear everything: her mother's footsteps in the corridor, her father's voice from the study 2 floors below, the particular sound of Clara on the stairs, careful and slow, pausing outside the door. Clara came to the door on the afternoon of the 4th day, and asked through it whether she could come in. Elena said, "I think it might be catching and I don't want you near it. I'm sleeping. I'll be better soon." There was a long pause on the other side of the door, the pause of someone standing very still. "I put some of the hothouse violets in a cup of water," Clara said finally. "Dorothea will bring them in." "Thank you," Elena said. Another pause, then Clara walked away. Her footsteps were slow and deliberate, and Elena could hear them all the way down the corridor until they turned the corner and became inaudible. She lay with her eyes closed and held the weight of what she was doing. She had known it would be difficult. She had calculated the cost against the alternative and found it acceptable. She still found it acceptable, but there is a considerable distance between understanding the cost of something and experiencing it, and lying in the dark listening to her sister's footsteps was not something any calculation had fully prepared her for. She did not change her mind. She held the cost completely and honestly and remained certain. On the evening of the 5th day, when the house had quieted and the last lights in the corridor had been extinguished, Dr. Hobb came to the side door of the house and was admitted by Dorothea, who had been waiting near it for the past hour. He did not come upstairs. This was the night they had planned for. Elena dressed in the dark in her warmest and plainest clothes while Dorothea watched the corridor. She retrieved the bundle from beneath the floorboard. She looked at the room for one moment, the books and the lamp and the shelf, the book of legal philosophy on the shelf. She left it and went downstairs without looking back. Dr. Hobb was waiting in the back hallway. They moved without speaking. Out the side door into the lane, which was completely dark and cold and smelled of frost and turned earth, Elena and Dorothea walked behind Dr. Hobb across the 2 fields to his surgery. 20 minutes that felt much longer. An owl called twice somewhere above them in the dark. The stars were hard and clear above the fields. The surgery cellar was dry, with a ventilation gap at ground level that allowed enough air circulation for a person to live in it, though not comfortably warm. Dr. Hobb had placed there a cot with 2 blankets, a lamp with oil sufficient for careful use over several days, a chamber pot, a supply of food and water for 12 days, and a stack of reading materials he had selected. Elinor went down the steps and stood in the small, underground room and looked at everything he had prepared. The reading, she said, she had noticed the top volume. Scottish legal history, he said, it seemed appropriate. She turned to Dorothea at the bottom of the stairs. Go back before the house wakes, she said quietly. Be careful with everything. Dorothea put both hands on Elinor's shoulders briefly. That was all. Then she went back up the stairs and the cellar door closed, and Elinor was in the underground dark. She lit the lamp at its lowest setting. She sat on the cot, she breathed. The silence had weight, the specific, complete silence of underground spaces that absorb sound from the world above and return nothing. Above her, the world was continuing without her. Within 24 hours, it would begin to believe that it was continuing without her permanently. The death certificate would be signed the following afternoon. Leonard Cole would do his part over the 2 days after that. There would be arrangements made and word sent to the county families and a note dispatched to Edmund Cavendish's London house, and all of it would happen above her head while she sat in the cellar with her lamp and her books and her £23 and her absolute intention to survive. She picked up the Scottish legal history and began to read. Dr. Hobb came down in the early mornings before his surgeries and sat on the bottom step and reported in brief, specific terms. He told her the death certificate had been signed on the 6th day, the wording exact and consistent with everything the household had observed. He told her that Leonard Cole had performed his responsibilities in the 36 hours following with reliability and without incident. He told her the funeral was arranged for Thursday. He told her on the morning of the 8th day that Clara had been found sitting on the floor outside Elinor's empty room, her back against the wall in the early morning light, not weeping, simply sitting there in the cold corridor, her knees drawn up, not moving. Dorothea had come to find her and had gently brought her downstairs. Elinor sat with this for a long time after Dr. Hobb had gone back up the stairs. She picked up the Scottish legal history. She read. Above her, the world prepared to bury Elinor Whitmore on Thursday morning. She lay in the cellar in the dark and breathed carefully in and breathed carefully out and thought about Edinburgh and a room of her own and a name she had chosen herself and the exact weight of what it meant to want your own life badly enough to pay this price for it. She had done the calculation. She had always found it acceptable. She found it acceptable still. She read until the lamp ran low, and then she lay in the dark and waited for morning, and morning came the way it always does, regardless of what is being held in the dark below it. On the morning of the funeral, Dorothea came down the cellar stairs before 5 o'clock and sat on the bottom step and told Elinor everything she had witnessed and heard in the days since the funeral preparations had begun. She spoke in a low, steady voice, delivering each detail in the order it had occurred without editorializing. She had always understood that Elinor needed accurate information more than comfort, and she had always been exceptionally good at providing what Elinor actually needed rather than what was easier to give. The county families had responded quickly. Word had spread through the district within 2 days of the official notification, and the Whitmore name, though diminished in its financial standing over the past several years, still carried enough weight in the county that the responses had come in promptly and in full. 4 families had sent flowers. The vicar had called twice and had been received by Lord Aldrich on both occasions with the quiet dignity of a man who is managing genuine shock. Lady Margaret had been handling the practical arrangements with a focused, quiet efficiency that was, Dorothea said, both impressive and slightly frightening, because Lady Margaret in quiet efficiency was a woman entirely absent her most characteristic quality, which was sound. Clara had not eaten a proper meal in 4 days. Dorothea reported this without inflection, and Elinor absorbed it without expression, which was all that was available to either of them in the circumstances. "Tell me about the Duke," Elinor said. Edmund Cavendish had received the formal notification at his London house and had replied within 24 hours. He intended to attend the funeral in person. He would make the journey from London and would be present at the church on Thursday morning. He sent his deepest condolences to the Whitmore family and asked whether there was anything the family required. No one at the Whitmore estate had quite known what to make of this. The engagement had been of 3 weeks' duration. The connection had been formal and brief. The county families, when they heard, had commented variously that it showed admirable respect, that it showed remarkable feeling for a man who had barely known the young woman, and one family, not known for either tact or accuracy, that it showed something a little too eager to be entirely proper. Lord Aldrich had said it was a mark of the Duke's character, and had seemed genuinely moved by the decision. Lady Margaret had not said anything about it, which was its own kind of response. He had arrived on the morning of the funeral in 2 carriages. He came to the house first and spoke with Lord Aldrich in the front hallway for approximately 10 minutes. He was composed entirely. He wore full mourning black, and he carried himself with the contained, directed quality of a man who has decided before entering a room what he will do in it. He spoke to Lord Aldrich with measured condolence, the correct words in the correct manner, and he did not stay longer than was required. The service was held at the parish church 2 miles from the estate. It was a cold, clear November morning with the particular quality of autumn light that makes everything look very distinct and too bright at the same time. Approximately 40 people gathered in the churchyard, which was a respectable number for a young woman from a county family, and they arranged themselves around the grave with the careful positioning of people who are not entirely certain of their relationship to the grief at hand. The vicar spoke for 15 minutes. He spoke of Eleanor's qualities in the general terms that clergymen use when they have not known the deceased well enough to be specific, and the general terms were warm enough and sufficiently respectful of her intelligence that at least 2 people in the gathering noticed with surprised approval. Lady Margaret stood through the entire service with her handkerchief pressed to her face. Lord Aldrich stood straight and barely moved. He had the bearing of a man holding himself together by force of habit. Clara stood nearest the grave. Dorothea paused when she reached Clara in the account. There was a quality in the pause that contained more than description. Then she said, "She didn't weep during the service. She stood and looked at the coffin the entire time. She had the look of someone who knows that what they are looking at is not entirely right but cannot yet understand why they know that." Eleanor said nothing. Dorothea continued. Edmund Cavendish had stood slightly apart from the main group in the correct and appropriate position of a man who was formally connected to this family and therefore had a legitimate place in the gathering. He was composed throughout the service. His expression was correct. He placed a single white flower on the coffin when the vicar invited those who wished to come forward. He said the correct things to Lord Aldrich at the conclusion of the service, briefly and without excess. And then, when the county families began to turn and move toward the gate, and when the gravediggers came forward to begin their work, Edmund Cavendish did not turn. He stayed. He stayed at the graveside after every other person had moved away, standing with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at the coffin now resting in the ground. The gravediggers waited at a respectful distance. The last of the other mourners were through the gate. No one approached him. No one called to him or waited for him. He simply stood there in the cold November morning light for what Dorothea, who had watched from near the gate, estimated was 3 or 4 minutes. Then he turned, walked to the gate, and went to his carriage. He did not stay for the funeral supper. He spoke briefly to Lord Aldrich at the gate, thanked him for the invitation to join the family, and said he had pressing matters in London that required his return. His carriages left the churchyard before 1 o'clock in the afternoon. They did not come back. Eleanor sat in the cellar in the quiet of that early morning and absorbed this piece by piece. She sat with the image of 4 minutes at a graveside after everyone else had walked away. She turned it over and examined it carefully. It was an unusual thing. Most men in Edmund Cavendish's position would have managed the funeral appearance with exactness and efficiency, and would have been in their carriage and moving toward London before the grave was fully closed. 4 minutes of private stillness at the grave of a woman he had known for 3 weeks was not the behavior of a man moving efficiently through a social obligation. What it was, she could not determine from a second-hand account. It could have been any number of things. She did not force any conclusion. She filed it the way she filed things she could not yet understand, which was carefully and without forcing. What else? Eleanor asked. Lord Aldrich had summoned Clara to his study 11 days after the funeral. The specific content of that conversation had not been shared with the household. Clara had emerged from the study looking pale and had gone directly to her room and stayed there for most of the afternoon. Dorothea had then, 2 days later, overheard enough of a conversation between Lord Aldrich and his solicitor, through the imperfectly closed door, to understand that preliminary inquiries were being made about the possibility of an introduction between the Duke of Ashford and Miss Clara Whitmore. The inquiry was in its earliest stages. Nothing formal had yet been communicated to the Duke's people. Elinor was quiet for a long moment. "Does Clara know what is being considered?" she asked. "She knows something is being discussed," Dorothea said carefully. "She has not been told anything directly. She has been very quiet." "Is she frightened?" Dorothea considered this honestly. "She is Clara," she said, which was an answer that Elinor understood completely. "If it progresses to anything formal," Elinor said, "you tell me immediately through the letters." "I will," Dorothea said. "And the Duke, has there been further communication from him since the funeral?" A letter had arrived from the Duke's solicitor approximately 2 weeks after the funeral. It concerned the financial settlement of the original arrangement. There had been costs incurred on the Cavendish side in preparing for the engagement. The letter offered, without negotiation, to absolve the Whitmore estate entirely of any financial obligation arising from the terminated arrangement. Lord Aldrich had read the letter in his study and had not spoken of it aloud, but Dorothea had seen his face when he emerged, and the expression on it was not one she could easily classify. Elinor sat with this. "How many more days?" she asked. "4," Dorothea said. "Dr. Hobbs says 4 days is the minimum. After that the burial is complete and confirmed, and the immediate attention of the household will have begun to settle." Elinor nodded. "Go back before the house wakes." Dorothea rose from the bottom step. She paused. "Clara has been putting fresh violets in the corridor outside the empty room every day since the funeral," she said. "Every morning fresh ones from the hothouse. She brings them herself." Elinor said nothing. She sat with the image of that, Clara moving through the cold morning to the hothouse and back, carrying fresh violets to an empty corridor each day since Thursday, and she held that image with the complete honesty she always brought to the things that cost the most, because there are costs you carry without setting down, and this was one of them. Then she reached for the book. She read. The 4 remaining days moved at their own pace, both slow and quick in the way that waiting always is when the thing you are waiting for is significant. Dr. Hobb came each morning. He reported that the household's grief was settling into the shape that grief takes when the first intensity has passed, and the long, ongoing reality of loss begins. Lady Margaret had resumed some of her usual patterns. Lord Aldrich was moving through estate business with concentrated attention. Clara had begun eating again, which Dorothea noted with the specific relief of someone who had been tracking exactly that fact with considerable worry. On the 11th day, before 3 o'clock in the morning, Dorothea came down the cellar stairs with Elinor's bundle and a freshly pressed coat, and a pair of good gloves, and the confirmed arrangement of a hired driver waiting in the lane outside. Elinor dressed in the cold underground room, put on the coat, and checked the bundle. She stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at the cellar one last time. The cot, the blankets, the lamp, the books, the room where she had spent 11 days being dead. She looked at it the way you look at a place where something genuinely important occurred. Then she went up the stairs. Dr. Hobb was in the dark kitchen. He looked at her with the checking attention of a physician. Then he handed her the sealed envelope containing the letter of introduction for Miss Ellie Worth, and he said, "Go safely, right through the system when you are settled." She went. The hired cart was outside on the lane. The horse was dark against the dark sky. The night was clear and cold. Elinor climbed into the cart and faced forward, and did not look back at a single landmark of the country that had been hers for 22 years. She faced forward and thought about Edinburgh and a room of her own, and the exact weight of what it felt like to be about to begin. The mail coach to Edinburgh took 2 full days, with one night stopped at a coaching inn in the Midlands, where Elinor slept for 5 hours on a narrow bed, in a room she shared with 2 women who were traveling north for their own reasons, and who asked no questions about hers. She was grateful for their silence. She was also, now that the cellar was behind her and the night journey was behind her and the distance between herself and Bath was growing with every hour, beginning to feel something she had not felt in weeks. She was beginning to feel, underneath the exhaustion and the remaining fear, the very first edge of something that might eventually become relief. She had reached Trowbridge, 15 miles from the Whitmore estate, before dawn on the first morning, in the hired cart with the unnamed driver who had received his payment in advance and who had spoken not a single word for the entire journey, which was exactly what she required. The mail coach had departed at 6. She had been one of 7 passengers, none of whom she knew and none of whom appeared to find her presence remarkable. She had kept her face turned toward the window and watched the English countryside move past in the grey early light, and she had thought about the next 2 days and about what came after them, and she had not thought about what she was leaving behind. She arrived in Edinburgh at 5:30 on the morning of the second day, when the city was still mostly dark but alive in the particular way of a city that has never truly stopped. The bakeries were open. Coal merchants were beginning their rounds. The gaslit street lamps made circles of orange light on the wet cobblestones. The mail coach set down its passengers at the central yard near the old town, and Elinor stepped down with her bundle and stood in the Edinburgh morning and breathed. The city smelled of coal smoke and river water and bread, and something sharp and mineral beneath all of it, the smell of old stone and high ground, and a place that had been making its own decisions for a very long time. Bath smelled of flowers and managed refinement. Edinburgh smelled of being actually inhabited by actual people who were busy with actual work. Elinor stood in the coaching yard with her bundle and felt, for the first time in 11 days, the cold air on her face and the specific pleasure of a city that did not care who she was. She walked from the coaching yard using the map she had memorized. Agnes Fenn's boarding house was on a respectable but not expensive street in the south side, 20 minutes away on foot. Elinor walked it slowly because she was noting the geography as she went, which streets connected to which, where the main thoroughfares ran, where the quieter residential lanes cut through, where the best vantage points were from which a person could see who was coming before being seen themselves. She was learning the geography the way she learned everything she needed, before she needed it thoroughly without gaps. Agnes Fenn answered the door herself at 6:15 in the morning, wearing an apron and apparently not at all surprised to find someone arriving at this hour. She was a small, broad-shouldered woman in her 60s with white hair and an expression of habitual, careful attention that was not unfriendliness, but was clearly the face of someone who had been reading situations for a long time and had become very good at it. "Miss Worth," Elinor said. The name sat in her mouth with complete ease as she had practiced it. "I believe you are expecting me. I have a letter from Dr. Henry Ward." Agnes looked at her. She looked at the letter which she took and read without opening. She looked at Elinor's face with the particular attention of someone assessing the gap between what they have been told and what is in front of them. Then she stepped back from the door. "Come in and have some tea. You look as though you have been traveling for a good while." The room Agnes showed her was small and clean, and had a window that looked out onto a narrow back lane where a cat was sitting on a wall in the early morning dark. The room contained a bed, a desk, a washstand, and a small bookshelf that was currently empty. The fireplace was unlit, but the grate was clean, and there was coal in the scuttle beside it. Elinor stood in the middle of the room with her bundle over one arm and looked at the window and the desk and the empty bookshelf. She felt, in that moment, something she had not felt in 22 years of living inside someone else's arrangement of her life. She felt the specific, clean sensation of a room that belonged to her. She set her bundle on the bed. She sat at the desk. She put her hands flat on the desktop and looked at the wall in front of her, which was plain white plaster with a small square mirror and a hook for a coat. She sat like that for about 2 minutes. Then she unpacked her bundle, methodically and in order, placing each item where it would live. The following morning she walked to a street optician she had identified the previous day, 3 streets from the boarding house, and purchased a pair of spectacles from the selection he kept in a tray on the counter. She chose a pair with small round frames that she did not need in any medical sense, but that changed the look of her face in 3 ways simultaneously. They narrowed the apparent width of her eyes, they created a point of focus for anyone looking at her face that drew attention away from her other features, and they made her look overall like someone whose primary occupation was sedentary and text-based, which was exactly what she intended to be. She paid the optician and put on the spectacles and walked home through the Edinburgh morning, looking at the city through glass she did not need. And the city looked exactly the same as it had without them, which was sharp and alive and entirely uninterested in her history. That evening in Agnes Fenn's small upstairs bathroom she cut her hair. She had brought scissors in her bundle for precisely this purpose. She stood before the mirror and worked carefully, cutting the auburn hair to a length that sat just below her jaw, which was shorter than she had ever worn it and which changed the shape of her face considerably. When she was finished, she gathered the cut lengths from the floor and put them in the fireplace and burned them. The woman in the mirror had shorter, darker hair and spectacles and tired eyes, and a set to her jaw that was, if she was honest with herself, not entirely different from Elinor Whitmore's jaw, but surrounded by enough changed detail that the difference was what you saw first. She was Ellie Worth, the name already fit. She applied a darkening rinse to her hair the following morning, purchased from a chemist 2 streets from the boarding house, who sold it without comment. The rinse deepened her natural auburn to a medium brown. She would need to reapply it every 4 weeks. She noted this in her journal as a routine item requiring scheduling. 2 weeks after her arrival, she walked to the offices of Hartley and Wren, solicitors in the new town, having found the notice of a position for a clerk and copyist in the Edinburgh Scotsman. She knocked and was admitted by Arthur Penn, who was 19 years old and looked at her with the focused uncertainty of someone who had not expected whoever came through the door to be what she was. She asked for the senior partner. Mr. Cecil Wren came out first. He said without any particular unkindness that he was not certain the position was suited to a female applicant, as the work required discretion and precision in handling sensitive legal documents, and he was not certain of the precedent. Eleanor said that discretion and precision were her primary professional qualities, and that the precedent would establish itself. Mr. Wren said he was not entirely sure about that. Mr. George Hartley appeared in the doorway of his inner office, and had the detached, practical manner of someone who has been in the law long enough to have learned that the most reliable indicator of a person's capability is the specific quality of their work, and not any characteristic of the person that fails to affect the work. He said, "Show me your handwriting." Eleanor sat at the empty desk and wrote the opening paragraph of a standard legal notice from memory, using the correct formatting conventions she had observed in years of reading legal documents in borrowed periodicals. She wrote it without pause and without error, in a clear and well-proportioned hand. Mr. Hartley read it. He looked at Eleanor over the top of his reading spectacles. "Can you start Monday?" Mr. Wren said, "George, I am not entirely." Mr. Hartley said, "The fellow's documents are required at court by the end of the month, Cecil, and we have no one to copy them." "Miss Worth, can you start Monday?" Eleanor said, "Yes." Arthur Penn, who had witnessed this exchange while pretending to be occupied with a document on his desk, looked at her when she stood to leave with an expression that was doing its best to be neutral and was not fully succeeding. He would spend the next 2 weeks deciding whether she was an asset or a complication, and would conclude at the beginning of the 3rd week that she was decisively the first, when he asked her to look over his contract drafting, and she found 3 errors he had not seen. The first 3 months were the most frightening of Eleanor's new life, not because anything went wrong. Nothing went wrong. The documents she copied were accurate. Mr. Hartley began assigning her additional tasks within the first week. She settled into the routines of the office with the efficiency of someone who had been preparing for exactly this kind of work for years. Agnes Fenn's boarding house became known and familiar. The streets between it and the office became known. She walked them every morning and every evening, and she learned which shopkeepers opened at what hours, and the exact time the baker on the corner put the morning rolls in the window. But every time a carriage stopped unexpectedly outside the office window, she went still. Every time the outer door opened and someone unfamiliar came through it, she looked up with an automatic assessment that took in height and build and walk in the half-second before she looked back down at her work. She did not let any of this show. She was Ellie Worth, reliable and unremarkable and accurate. Over the first winter, slowly, she learned to breathe properly again. 3 years moved differently than Eleanor had expected them to. She had imagined, in the cellar and on the mail coach, and in the first frightening weeks of her new Edinburgh life, that the years would feel like something she was enduring. A long and careful corridor she was moving through toward some eventual point of genuine safety. She had not imagined that they would feel, increasingly, like something she was actively building. But that was what happened. She built a life piece by piece, with the same methodical attention she brought to every serious task, and the life she built surprised her by being genuinely her own. Mr. Hartley noticed her legal eye within the first 4 months. It had started with the Alderton contract, a property matter whose drafted agreement contained an ambiguity in the covenant clause that would, Eleanor had seen immediately, create a significant problem at enforcement. She had added a small note to the side of the copy she was preparing, pointing this out and indicating the relevant precedent. Mr. Hartley had come to her desk the following morning and stood there looking at the note, and then at Eleanor. "You saw this yourself," he said. "It was visible in the original draft," Eleanor said. He considered this. He said, "In future, when you see such things, bring the note to me before it goes into the copy. Do not annotate the copy itself." From that point forward, he had begun assigning her the additional task of reviewing draft correspondence before it was sent. This was not her official role, but had become necessary in practice because her eye for ambiguity and error was more reliable than Mr. Wren's, a fact that Mr. Wren had decided to treat as an administrative arrangement rather than a professional admission. She was given a small salary increase at the start of her second year. By the middle of that year, she was attending certain client meetings as the record keeper and summary writer, which meant she was present for substantive professional conversations she found deeply interesting, and from which she was learning things about legal practice that no amount of solitary reading could have replicated. She moved from Agnes Fenn's boarding house to the rooms above the bakery on Clerk Street in October of her second year. She had found them through a notice in the window of the very bakery itself, which she had been walking past every morning for 14 months without noticing the sign, until the morning she noticed it and went inside and spoke to Mr. Callum Finch, who was broad and flower-dusted and cautious in the way of a man who has rented rooms before and learned from the experience. He asked for references. She gave him Agnes Fenn's name and Mr. Hartley's name, and he asked them and both replied promptly, and he handed her the key 2 days later. The smell of bread reached her every morning through the floorboards, beginning before 5. It became, within the first week, one of the things she valued most about her days. It was the smell of something being made early in the morning by someone who had decided to make it, which seemed, when she thought about it at all, like exactly the right smell for a beginning. She set up her own bank account 2 streets away. She deposited a portion of her salary each month and withdrew from it only what was necessary. She was building reserves always. It was a habit of mind she had no interest in relinquishing. In her second Edinburgh winter, she began attending the meetings of the Women's Suffrage Society. The chapter met in a room on the 3rd floor of a building off Canongate, up a narrow stair, and the room was always crowded and always loud in a way she found, after a period of adjustment, invigorating. These were women who argued publicly and without apology about things that mattered, and who had developed, from years of doing so, a collective intelligence about tactics and language that Alina found more sophisticated than she had expected. She met Nora Bridges at the second meeting. Nora was 41, red-haired and direct-spoken, and she had the specific quality of a person who is not interested in your agreement but is very interested in your reasoning. She had asked Alina at the end of the second meeting, standing near the door while the room emptied around them, what her professional background was. Alina said she worked in law. Nora said immediately, "Then you can be useful to us. We have a petition in draft, and no one in this room can write a sentence that a solicitor would take seriously. Will you look at it?" Alina asked to see what they had. She spent the following Saturday rewriting it from the beginning. Nora had read the result with a focused attention and then said, "This is exactly what it needs to be. Why didn't you write it in the first place?" Alina said because she had not been asked. Nora said she was asking now and in future would continue to ask. Their friendship developed from the work, which was the kind of friendship Alina was best at building. It did not require the disclosure of personal history. It required reliability and honesty, and the willingness to argue when you believed the other person was wrong, which both of them did regularly and without damage to the underlying connection. She met Harriet Bloom at Agnes Fenn's boarding house in her first spring. Harriet was a music teacher, 28, with the warm and unguarded curiosity of someone who liked people immediately and without reservation. She asked Alina more personal questions than Alina found comfortable, but she asked them with such genuine warmth that resentment was almost impossible. Alina had grown to value Harriet's company more than she would have predicted. Harriet called on her at Clerk Street on Sunday afternoons, and they drank tea and Harriet talked, and Alina listened, and occasionally said something that made Harriet laugh with the specific surprised delight of someone who had not expected Alina to be funny. Alina did not consider herself funny. She considered herself accurate about people, and accuracy about people was frequently indistinguishable from wit. Dorothea's coded letters arrived every few weeks, always about gardening, always containing the precise information Alina had been waiting for. The violet in the letters was always Alina. Clara was always primroses. A recurring blue flower that Dorothea had assigned to Edmund Cavendish appeared occasionally, and without explanation, which was typical of Dorothea's efficient approach to the code. The blue flower references told her he had withdrawn his inquiry regarding Clara within 8 days of the funeral. He had not subsequently made any other arrangement in any similar direction. He had, sometime in the following autumn, closed his financial connection with the Whitmore household entirely through solicitors, settling the outstanding matters cleanly and making no further contact with any member of the family. In the spring of Alina's second year, she received a letter that spoke of primroses in full bloom and an arrangement made with great care by someone choosing for herself which flowers she would have in her new garden. The letter told Alina in careful code that Clara Whitmore had married in April a schoolmaster named Frederick George, a solid and kind man of respectable character whom Clara had met through a family connection and had agreed to marry without any arrangement being made on her behalf. Alina had read this letter alone in the Clerk Street rooms on a Sunday morning in April, with the bread smell rising through the floor and the Edinburgh light cold and clear. She had sat at her desk and held the letter and let the news arrive in her fully and completely. Clara in a church of her own choosing with a man of her own choosing, Clara who had sat in the corridor on the floor with the violets. She had put her head down on her desk and wept for approximately 15 minutes, which was not something she usually permitted herself, and which was, on this occasion, the only appropriate response. Then she had washed her face and gone to the Tuesday review of Nora's petition draft. She sent an anonymous money order to Dr. Hobb each December, as she had done since the first December after Edinburgh. She had written a brief note with the first one. She had sent nothing written since then. She was careful always about what could be traced. By the autumn of 1890, Ellie Worth was 25 years old and had been building her Edinburgh life for 3 years. She had work she was good at, and that continued to grow in complexity and responsibility. She had 2 friendships that were genuine, one built on arguing productively and one built on Sunday afternoon tea. She had a room that smelled of bread and belonged entirely to her. She had money in the bank and the steady accumulation of professional skill, and the specific, irreplaceable satisfaction that comes from building something real with your own hands and living inside it every day. She was happy, not the perfect happiness of someone who has achieved everything they wanted, but the deeper satisfaction of someone who has built something real and chosen every element of it. It was quiet and it was watchful, and it was hers, and those 3 qualities together were more than she had believed possible in the cold garden in Bath 3 years ago. She arrived at work on a Tuesday morning in October and found a new case file on her desk, a land boundary dispute in the Scottish borders. She had been assigned the correspondence indexing and the document preparation. She opened the file and began to read. The name was on the 3rd letter. Alina had been working through the case file for 40 minutes, indexing each document by date and subject, and preparing the reference summary that would allow Mr. Hartley to review the matter quickly before the client meeting. The case was a boundary dispute in the Scottish borders regarding several hundred acres that the instructing party claimed had been incorrectly incorporated into a neighboring estate's holdings some 40 years earlier. It was a common enough type of case. The legal questions were not unusual. The document trail was well organized. She had found the work straightforward and was moving through it efficiently. She turned the page to the 3rd letter in the correspondence sequence. She saw the name in the first line of the 3rd paragraph in the formal identification of the instructing party. Edmund Cavendish, 5th Duke of Ashford. She put the letter down. She did not drop it. She set it down on the desk with a deliberateness that was more controlled than usual, which was the only external sign of what had just happened inside her. She sat with her hands flat on the desk surface for a moment. Then she picked the letter back up and read the paragraph again, because she had in the first reading experienced one of those brief mechanical failures of comprehension, where the eye passes over words that the mind refuses immediately to accept, and she needed the second reading to confirm that the first had been accurate. It was accurate. It was not a relative or a namesake or a coincidence. The title was specific, the Christian name was specific, the family name was specific, and the connection to the Derbyshire estates and to the Scottish border holdings was consistent with everything she had known about the Cavendish holdings since the autumn of 1887. She spent the rest of that morning working through the file. Her hands were steady, her handwriting was accurate. The reference summary she completed by noon was exactly as thorough and well organized as any other summary she had ever produced for this firm. She ate her noon meal at her desk and did not go out, which she occasionally did when a matter needed to be finished by end of day, and which gave her no reason to explain herself to Arthur Penn, who was occupied with a lease renewal on the other side of the room, and had, in 3 years of sitting across from Alina, developed the practical wisdom to understand that she did not particularly want to be chatted to when she was working. What was happening inside her, under the outer composure she had spent 3 years developing, was a different kind of work entirely. She was thinking about the geography of this building. The conference room was at the back, accessible through a corridor, with a door that was generally kept closed. She did not enter the conference room unless specifically required. She was a clerk. She indexed and copied and managed correspondence and occasionally attended client meetings as record keeper. But the initial consultations with new clients were conducted by Mr. Hartley and sometimes Mr. Wren. There was no particular reason she would be placed in direct proximity to this client. She was also thinking about the outer office, and where her desk sat in relation to the main entrance, and the route that anyone coming to a meeting would take to reach the conference room corridor. Her desk was beside the window, on the right-hand side of the room as you entered. To reach the conference room, a visitor walked across the full width of the outer office. Her desk was not directly in that path, but it was in the same room that path crossed. She was Ellie Worth. She wore spectacles she did not need. Her hair was darker than it had been and shorter than she had ever worn it. 3 years had passed. He had met Eleanor Whitmore on approximately 8 occasions over 3 weeks in the autumn of 1887. People saw what they expected to see. She held all of this in the organized way she held complicated information, clearly, without forcing any conclusion, watching which pieces carried the most weight. Mr. Hartley announced 2 days later that the Ashford client would be coming in person to review the preliminary findings. He would arrive the following Thursday at 10 o'clock. Eleanor sat at her desk and processed this. She considered with complete seriousness requesting a day of personal leave on Thursday. She dismissed the idea within the hour. She had given this firm 3 years of reliability and had never once requested a personal day without clear reason. Requesting one on the specific day of a significant client meeting would create exactly the kind of notice she could not afford. The one thing she could not do above all other things was be noticed. She would be at her desk on Thursday at her usual hour. Wednesday evening she walked home from the suffrage meeting and encountered Harriet at the bottom of Clerk Street, who had been passing in the other direction and who stopped and said that Eleanor looked as though she were thinking very carefully about something. Eleanor said she had a complicated matter at work she was working through. Harriet accepted this with the look of someone who respects the right to have private concerns, and they said good night. Eleanor went upstairs and lit the lamp and sat at her desk for an hour without opening anything. Then she made tea and went to bed and slept adequately, which was more than she had expected. Thursday morning, she arrived at her desk at 7 o'clock, her usual hour. She sorted the morning's correspondence with the same attention she always gave it. She made notes on 2 unrelated property matters that needed attention before the end of the week. She drank her morning tea. Arthur Penn arrived at 8:30 and said good morning, and she said good morning back. The morning was a morning. She was Ellie Worth at her desk doing her work. At 9:45, she heard a carriage on the street outside. She did not look up. A moment later the outer door of the building opened. She heard Frederick's voice first. She had heard it only a handful of times in her life, but she recognized it immediately, that particular flat, efficient tone of a man whose primary professional function is to ensure that things proceed smoothly and without unnecessary complication. Then she heard Mr. Wren's voice in the outer hallway, welcoming, moving from his office to greet the arrivals. Then, through the inner corridor door that was standing half open, she heard the Duke of Ashford's voice. It arrived in her body before her mind had finished processing the sound. 3 years had passed since she had heard it, and she heard it now through a partially open door, and it was still unmistakably the measured, unhurried, completely self-contained voice she had heard at dinner in Bath, in the garden in Bath, through the drawing-room door in Bath. The quality of it did not age. Precision does not age. Eleanor kept her eyes on the document in front of her. She kept her pen moving. She breathed with deliberate steadiness, and she made her hand write the words on the page in front of her one after another in the correct sequence. The inner door opened fully. Mr. Wren led the visitors through the outer office toward the conference room corridor. Eleanor did not look up. Edmund Cavendish walked across the outer office. He was taller than she had carried him in her memory, or perhaps it was only that the rooms of this building were smaller than the rooms of the Whitmore estate. He was dressed in dark traveling clothes. He carried a document folder that had apparently been handed to him as he entered the building, and which he was reading as he walked, with the focused ease of someone accustomed to doing two things simultaneously with equal efficiency. He passed within 6 feet of Aliner's desk. He did not look up from the document. The conference room door opened and closed behind the group. Aliner sat at her desk. She looked at the document in front of her. She had been writing a summary clause about a drainage easement on a property in Fife, and the clause was still where she had left it, mid-sentence, exactly as accurate as the rest of it. She noted this. She was functioning. She was Ellie Worth, and she was at her desk doing her work, and she was fine. The conference room remained closed for approximately 2 hours. Aliner worked through both of them without pause, without conversation with Arthur Penn, without any break from the rhythm of the morning. When the conference room door opened at last, she heard the voices in the corridor, Mr. Wren's and Frederick's and the Duke's, arranging a follow-up document to be prepared and delivered within the week. They crossed the outer office. She kept her head down and her pen moving and watched from the very lowest edge of her vision as they passed. The outer door opened. He left. Frederick followed. The door closed. Aliner set down her pen. She sat for a moment with her hands in her lap. Then she pulled the Ashford case file across her desk and opened it to the first page and began reading it again, this time not as a clerk preparing a reference summary but as herself, asking what she actually knew and what was in these pages that she might have passed over too quickly the first time. She read for nearly 2 hours. The case was exactly as she had assessed it on the first reading, clear-cut and well-documented. She worked through every document in the file with the methodical attention she gave to legal questions that mattered. She found nothing unexpected in the main body of the correspondence. At the very back of the preliminary folder, misbound behind the last exhibit sheet, was a document that did not belong to the current case. It was a single sheet of personal correspondence, clearly separated from a different file at some point during the transfer of documents from the previous London firm and misfiled by whatever clerk had assembled the transfer package. She found it because she was looking at everything, which was a habit of 3 years of careful and thorough work. You looked at everything, because the things that mattered were sometimes in the places you had almost not bothered to check. The letter was dated in the spring of 1887. It was from Edmund Cavendish to his own London solicitor, written in his precise, unembellished hand, concerning a matter entirely unrelated to the Scottish Borders case. She read the letter's opening line and stopped. She read it again from the beginning. The letter described the establishment of a small anonymous fund, to be settled through intermediaries so that the source would not be disclosed, for the benefit of the domestic servants at the Whitmore household. The reasoning given was that following the death of Miss Aliner Whitmore, whose engagement to the Duke had been recently formalized, and whose sudden illness had cut short what had been expected to be a long connection between the two families, it seemed right that those in service should not suffer a reduction in their circumstances as a direct result of events that no one could have anticipated. He specified an amount. He asked that it be arranged so that the Whitmore family would not know the source. He wrote, the young woman's death was sudden and unexpected, and it is right that those in service should not suffer a reduction in their circumstances as a direct result. Aliner sat at her desk in the outer office of Hartley and Wren on a Thursday afternoon in October 1890, and read that letter 4 times. She sat with it for a long time after that. Then she placed it carefully in the back of the case folder, exactly where she had found it, and closed the folder, and sat at her desk while the Edinburgh afternoon moved forward outside the window, and Arthur Penn left for the day, and Mr. Wren's lamp went out in the inner office, and she sat very still and thought about a man who had arranged in secret through intermediaries, so that the servants of a grieving household would not lose income over a death he had no legal or social obligation to compensate for. She thought about this for a long time. Then she put on her coat and hat and walked home through the Edinburgh evening, and she thought about it all the way home, and she thought about it that night lying in the dark above the bakery, and she thought about it when she woke before 5 the following morning with the smell of bread coming up through the floorboards. She thought, who writes a letter like that? And then she thought, and what does it mean that he did? She began the investigation the following morning. She had access, through the legitimate framework of the Borders case, to documents and inquiries she could make through professional channels without any explanation being required. She had contacts at 2 other Edinburgh firms established through 3 years of correspondence on shared client matters. She knew a retired advocate who attended the suffrage meetings and who had a memory for the legal histories of prominent families that was both extensive and reliable. She knew, through Arthur Penn's wider network of junior clerks, a man at the land registry who had been in his position for 12 years and knew the documentary history of most of the significant estates in Scotland and northern England. She started that same morning. She requested, through the Borders case framework, the General Estate Correspondence Archive from the Cavendish holdings covering the past 10 years, citing the need to understand the historical context of the boundary dispute. It was a legitimate research request. Mr. Hartley approved it without question, and the documents arrived by the following Thursday. What she read over the next several days was careful and specific, and told a consistent story. The average tenure of Edmund Cavendish's household staff was 17 years. His housekeeper, a Mrs. Dorothy Lane, had been in her position for 31 years and showed no sign of any intention to leave it. His head groundskeeper had been in his post for 23 years. His personal man, Frederick, had been with him for 14. These were not numbers associated with a household managed by fear or contempt. Staff who feared their employers left at the first safe opportunity, and they left in numbers and they left quickly. Staff who stayed for decades did so because they had been given reason to stay. 17 years was not an accident, 31 years was a statement. His tenants across the Derbyshire and Scottish estates had brought no complaints to any relevant authority in the previous 15 years. There had been a drainage dispute with a tenant farmer in 1882, resolved by mediation, the costs of which Edmund Cavendish had settled in full for both parties, which was not the standard resolution, and was notably more generous than convention required of him. His rents had not been increased in 12 years, during a period when most estate owners in equivalent positions had raised theirs considerably. She did not know whether this represented sentiment or principle. She thought, reading the pattern of it alongside the drainage costs and the servant's letter, that it was more likely principle. She asked Harold Graves about the whisper regarding Edmund Cavendish and his first wife. She asked him at the end of the Tuesday suffrage meeting, in the stairwell while the other members filed past, and she asked him directly, because directness with Harold Graves produced better results than circumlocution. He was a retired advocate, and he could hear the difference. He said, "I know the whole of it, why do you ask?" Eleanor said she had a professional reason for understanding its origins. Graves told her. The whisper had originated in 1884, the year after the first Duchess had died. It had been started by a family named Fairfax, who had lost a land dispute against the Cavendish estate in 1880, in a case that the court had decided against them on entirely legitimate grounds after a thorough review of the property records. The Fairfax family had concluded that the outcome had cost them more than the land was worth in both money and reputation, and the whisper about the Duchess had been their retaliation. There was no basis for it in any record or any account from anyone with genuine knowledge of the Cavendish household. The first Duchess had died of pneumonia in January 1883 after a marriage of 15 years. In legal circles, Graves said, the Fairfax origin of that story has been understood for some time. Anyone who looked at the evidence carefully knew what it was and where it came from. Eleanor thanked him and walked home from the meeting through the cold Canongate evening, thinking. She sat at her desk for 3 evenings in a row and worked through everything she had found, writing it in the journal in clear and specific terms. The 17-year average tenure, the 31-year housekeeper, the drainage costs settled beyond what was required, the rents unchanged for 12 years, the fabricated rumor and its confirmed origin in a family seeking revenge for a lost legal case. The first Duchess dead of genuine pneumonia after 15 years of marriage, with no record of complaint from any person, with actual knowledge of the household. A man who had not remarried after 1883, a man who had not pursued another arrangement after Eleanor's death, a man who had withdrawn from the inquiry about Clara within 8 days of the funeral, which she had known from Dorothea's coded letters, and which now sat differently alongside everything else she had found. She wrote in her journal, "The picture I had of Edmund Cavendish was built from 2 things, what my father gave me and what fear gave me. What my father gave me was a dinner where I was not asked a single question, and an arrangement that was presented to me as already settled, which was his dishonesty, not necessarily a reflection of Edmund Cavendish's intention. What fear gave me was the worst reasonable interpretation of insufficient evidence. The picture that emerges from the actual record is clear and consistent. It is the picture of a man whose treatment of the people in his life is, at minimum, decent and respectful. This does not undo what was done to me. I was arranged and traded without my knowledge or my consent and without anyone thinking it necessary to ask me. That was a genuine wrong. But the question now is not whether a wrong was done to me. That question is settled. The question is what the truth of who Edmund Cavendish actually is requires of me now that I have access to it. She set down the pen. She sat with that paragraph for a long time. Harriet had noticed, over the previous 2 weeks, that Alina was somewhere else. She said so on Sunday afternoon in the Clerk Street rooms, while pouring a second cup of tea. In the direct and warm way she said most things. She said Alina had been thinking hard about something for 2 weeks, and that she wasn't going to ask what it was, but she was noting it. Alina said she was working through something important. Harriet said, "Is it a professional matter or a personal one?" Alina said, "Both." Harriet nodded and poured the tea and talked about something else entirely, which was one of Harriet's most useful qualities. She understood when the most helpful thing she could offer was the comfort of ordinary conversation, and she offered it without making anything of the substitution. At the Tuesday meeting, Nora Bridges noticed Alina sitting in the back row not arguing about anything, which was notable enough that Nora looked at her twice during the discussion. Afterward, at the door, Nora said, "You were quiet tonight." Alina said she was thinking through a decision. Nora looked at her with the direct attention she gave to things that mattered and said, "Make it cleanly, whatever it is." Then she put on her coat and left. Alina walked home. She sat at the desk in the lamplight for a long time. She thought about what the continuation of the current situation required from her. Edmund Cavendish was a client of this firm on a substantial ongoing matter. He would return to the office. She had managed one crossing of the outer office once, which had required considerable internal effort and had left her thinking about the misfiled letter for the subsequent 5 days. She could manage it again, but managing it indefinitely across multiple visits over however many months the boarder's case required to resolve was a different calculation, and it grew less reliable with each additional instance. The mathematics of repeated proximity eventually produced a result she could not control. She also thought, with the honesty she always brought to the things she most needed to look at clearly, about what had happened inside her when she had heard his voice through the corridor door. She had not expected it to arrive the way it did, before her mind had finished processing the sound, the way the body recognizes things the mind hasn't yet caught up with. She had thought 3 years of distance and the careful construction of a different self would have resolved whatever reaction she might have. She had been wrong about that. She wrote in her journal, "What I want is to address this directly, under conditions I control, and to tell the truth. What I owe Edmund Cavendish is not the continuation of a deception. What I owe myself is the agency to decide what happens next, and the honesty to act on what I have found." She wrote 4 pages of terms over the following 2 evenings. She wrote them in the legal language she had been using for 3 years, clear, specific, grounded, without any clause that was negotiable, because she had decided the terms were correct and she would not soften them for the sake of making them easier to accept. Her right to continue her professional work at Hartley and Wren, her right to maintain independent finances, her right to her own correspondence, her right to travel without requiring permission from anyone, her right to be consulted on any decision that directly affected her life, her right to the Edinburgh house as her primary residence, her right to be addressed, in all legal and social contexts, as a person with these rights and not as someone who had traded them away. She wrote a note to Mr. Hartley the following morning, requesting that she be assigned to deliver the preliminary case summary to the Ashford client at his next visit. She noted that she had prepared the summary in full and believed a direct delivery would allow her to address any questions about the document organization with efficiency. Mr. Hartley's reply was on her desk when she arrived the next morning. He said yes. He said he had been meaning to give her more direct client responsibility and was glad she had asked. The next client meeting was scheduled for Wednesday at 10 o'clock. Alina read the note, she folded it, she put it in her desk. She had 6 days. She spent them as she always spent her days, working at the firm with full attention, walking her established routes, attending the Thursday meeting and arguing with Nora about a clause in a draft statement until Nora said she was right, which Nora said rarely and which Alina therefore noted. She drank tea with Harriet on Sunday afternoon and listened while Harriet talked about her students and the particular challenge of teaching music to someone who had no natural sense of time. She was present in every ordinary thing she did, and she let the 6 days carry her forward in the way that time does when a decision has been made, and the decision is the right one. On Tuesday evening, Harriet walked with her part of the way home and said at their corner, "You look settled about something." Elinor said she had made a decision. Harriet said simply, "Good." They said good night. Elinor walked the rest of the way home alone in the Edinburgh dark. The cold October air was clean in her lungs. The city was lit and busy around her. The smell of the bakery was beginning already at the bottom of Clerk Street. She let herself into her rooms, sat at her desk, and looked at the envelope containing the 4 pages of terms which had been sitting in the journal cover for 2 days. She was not afraid in the way she had expected to be. She was afraid of Wednesday at 10 o'clock specifically, of this one conversation in this one room. That was a contained and manageable fear, the kind that clarifies rather than paralyses. She was not afraid of what came after. She had written the terms. The terms were correct and she would not alter them. She was not afraid of Edmund Cavendish or of what he would do when he understood what she was telling him. She was not certain what he would do. She had thought about it and had concluded that she did not need to be certain. She had done her investigation. She had read everything available to her. The shape of who he was had emerged from that reading clearly and consistently. She was not afraid of that shape. She thought about pale grey eyes that had paused before the word "some" when she asked about law. She thought about a book of legal philosophy sent from London, with a card that said the Ashford Library was understocked. She thought Wednesday at 10. She went to bed. She was at her desk at 7 o'clock on Wednesday morning, as always. The outer office was quiet. The early Edinburgh light came grey and clean through the windows. Elinor sorted the morning's correspondence, added 3 items to the pending reference file, and made notes on a property matter that needed attention before noon. She worked steadily and without rushing, because rushing would mean that Wednesday morning had become different from every other morning, and it had not. She was Ellie Worth at her desk doing her work. The 10 o'clock meeting was simply a meeting. At 9:30 she went to the document cabinet and collected the Ashford case summary she had prepared over the previous 2 days. The preliminary findings on the boundary dispute, the map copies, the evidence schedule, and the letter she had drafted herself setting out the current legal position with full clarity. She placed these in a folder. She looked at the folder for a moment. Then she went back to her desk and took the envelope containing the 4 pages of terms from inside the journal she had brought with her that morning, the journal she did not usually bring to the office, and which Ellie Worth therefore had no particular reason to be carrying. She placed the envelope inside the folder, beneath the case documents, where it would not be visible until she chose to produce it. At 5 minutes to 10, she walked down the inner corridor to the conference room at the back of the building. She heard the carriage on the street as she was walking. She heard the outer door open a moment later. She heard Mr. Hartley's brief welcoming exchange in the outer hallway, and Frederick's voice in response, and then the inner corridor door opening. She reached the conference room first. She went inside. She placed the folder on the table. She took the chair on the near side of the table, the chair that faced the door directly. She sat down. She placed her hands flat on the table, and then she moved them to her lap, because flat hands on a table was the posture of someone managing themselves with deliberate effort, and she did not want her posture to say that before she had said anything with her words. The door opened. Edmund Cavendish came in and closed the door behind him. He was alone. He had left Frederick in the outer area, which told her this had been arranged as a working meeting with a member of the firm's staff rather than a formal client consultation requiring the partners present. He carried no documents of his own. He pulled out the chair on the far side of the table and sat down without ceremony. He looked at the folder on the table. Then he looked at the person sitting across from it. Elinor looked back at him. She let him look. She had decided in advance not to rush any of it. She would let each moment complete itself before the next one began, because this conversation was one she intended to move through with full attention and full honesty, and both of those things required time. She reached up and removed her spectacles. She set them on the table. She kept her eyes on his face. The silence lasted 7 seconds. She counted them. She watched him look at her. She watched his face perform a journey she had tried to anticipate and had not entirely succeeded in anticipating, because the reality of it was more specific and more human than anticipation can ever be. She watched the initial courteous professional attention of a man looking at a solicitor's clerk shift into something else. She watched him see her face without the spectacles. She watched him register her hair and her jaw and the particular set of her shoulders, and she watched the moment of recognition arrive in his pale gray eyes not as a flash but as a slow, certain, inevitable thing, the way light arrives at dawn, gradually and then completely. He said nothing for a long moment. Outside, Edinburgh continued, a cart on the cobblestones, a voice somewhere on the street, the pigeons shifting on the ledge above the window. Then he said very quietly, "Miss Whitmore." Not a question, a statement. The statement of a man who has just received the answer to a question he has been carrying forward for 3 years. Elinor said, "I would like to explain." He said, "I think you had better." His voice was controlled. Everything about him was controlled, the same measured, contained quality she had observed in Bath, in the garden, at the dinner table. But underneath the control there was something she had not seen before, something making itself felt in the slight tension around his jaw and in the quality of the silence before he had spoken. She thought it might be the same thing she had heard about from Dorothea. That complicated thing that was neither grief nor anger, but contained both, and was also something else that she could not yet name, and did not try to name yet. She told him everything. She had decided in advance to tell it in order, beginning to beginning, and she held to that. She started with the staircase in the Whitmore house and the sound of 2 crystal glasses touching. She told him about the dinner and the cold garden and the 3 words she had written in her journal. She told him about Dorothea and Dr. Hobb and the 6 weeks of careful, methodical preparation. She told him about the chalk powder and the symptoms and the death certificate. She told him about the cellar and the 11 days underground and the sounds she had heard through the floor. Her mother's footsteps, her father's voice from the study below, Clara asking through the door to come in and Elinor turning her away with a thin voice and a lie. She told him about the night coach and the mail coach and arriving in Edinburgh at 5:30 in the morning when the city smelled of coal smoke and bread. She told him about Ellie Worth and Agnes Fenn and the spectacles and the hair rinse applied every 4 weeks and the rooms above the bakery where the smell of bread came through the floor every morning at 5. She told him about 3 years of building a life she had chosen for herself, piece by piece, in a city she had arrived in with £23 and a false letter of introduction and the absolute intention to survive and then to thrive. She told him about the case file landing on her desk and the name in the 3rd letter. She told him about the 7 seconds of sitting still before she picked the letter back up and read it again. She told him about the misfiled personal letter at the back of the preliminary folder and what it had said about the servants, and that she had read it 4 times. He listened without a single interruption through all of it. She watched him listen. She watched him manage his own responses to what she was telling him, the responses visible in small, controlled ways, the slight change in his breathing when she described the cellar, the controlled stillness of his face when she described Clara sitting on the corridor floor. Once, when she told him that Lord Aldrich had begun making inquiries about Clara within 10 days of the funeral, she watched something move through his eyes that was cold and precise, and directed at a person who was not in the room. When she finished, the conference room was very quiet. He sat with his hands flat on the table, looking at a point just past her shoulder for a long time. Then he said, "What your father told me." His voice was still controlled, the edges of it were not. "He told me through his intermediary that the arrangement was welcome to both parties, that you had been consulted and had expressed your willingness to proceed, that it was a match that suited everyone involved." A brief pause. "I was told that you had said yes, I would not have proceeded otherwise. I am not in the habit of entering arrangements that one party has not freely chosen. I do not consider that consistent with any principle I hold." Elinor looked at him. She thought about the 31-year housekeeper and the drainage costs and the fabricated rumor and the misfiled letter and the 4 minutes at the graveside. She thought about a book of legal philosophy sent from London with a card that said the Ashford Library was understocked. She said, "My father told you a lie." He said, "Your father told me a lie." The words were level and exact, the temperature behind them was not. "I have terms," Elinor said. A very slight pause, something shifted in his expression. "I expected nothing less," he said. She opened the folder and took out the envelope and placed it on the table between them. She had not planned to explain it before he read it. She let it sit there. He picked it up, he opened it. He read it in the way she had hoped he would read it, completely, from the first line to the last clause, without skimming, without performance, with the genuine attention of a man taking a document seriously because he has decided the document is serious. It took him several minutes. She watched him read. When he looked up, he was looking at her directly. "I see no counter-argument to any of this," he said. "There isn't one," she said. He asked for a pen. She handed him the pen from the folder. He signed each clause. He placed the signed document on the table between them and put the pen down. There was another silence. This one was different from the first. The first had been the silence of recognition and shock. This one had cleared and settled into something new, the silence of two people who have said what needed to be said and find themselves standing somewhere neither of them had quite planned to stand. Alina said, "I should tell you that the terms include my continued position at this firm." "Of course," he said. "And that the Edinburgh house is our primary residence." "Also of course." She looked at him carefully. "You have already read all 4 pages." "I read the document," he said, "all of it." She thought about that for a moment. She thought about a man who, when given a document to read, actually read it. She thought about all the evidence she had assembled over 2 weeks, the long-tenured staff and the unchanged rents and the fabricated rumor and the misfiled letter. And she thought about this man sitting across from her at a conference table in Edinburgh who had just signed a document she had written giving her every right she had specified without asking to change a single word. They met 3 more times before the end of October. The meetings were honest and occasionally contentious in the way that 2 people argue when both of them have good arguments, and neither of them has any interest in conceding ground they believe is theirs. On one occasion, when she pushed back on an assumption he had made about household staffing in the Edinburgh house, they went 3 full exchanges before arriving at an agreement that satisfied both of them. On another, when he raised a legitimate structural concern about a clause she had written, he was correct, and she revised the clause, and he accepted the revision without making anything of the fact that he had been right. She found the experience of arguing with someone who argued back with accuracy, and without needing to win, to be one of the more unexpected things she encountered in the entire process. They were married in April 1891 in a registry office in Edinburgh. Agnes Fenn was the witness and wore her best coat. Harriet wept with the genuine and uncomplicated happiness of someone who is very glad something difficult has worked out, and pressed Alina's hand at every opportunity. Nora Bridges attended the small gathering afterward and shook Alina's hand firmly and said, "Well done, now don't disappear on us. The June petition needs reviewing by the end of next month." Alina said she would have it finished by May. Dorothea arrived 3 days after the wedding with 2 trunks, and the composed, quietly satisfied efficiency of someone who has been waiting patiently for a situation to resolve correctly and is now ready to proceed. She settled into the management of the Edinburgh house with the same quiet effectiveness she had always brought to the Whitmore estate, and the Edinburgh house ran, from the first week, exactly as she intended it to. A letter arrived at the Edinburgh house in November, forwarded by Dorothea from a return address in Wiltshire. The handwriting on the inner letter was Clara's, slightly more assured than Alina remembered it from 4 years ago. Clara wrote, "I have read your letter 11 times. I intend to be very angry with you for a considerable period, which I believe you have well earned, and also very glad that you are alive, which I believe you have always deserved. I expect these 2 things can coexist without difficulty. I am a schoolmaster's wife in Wiltshire. Frederick is solid and kind and taller than I expected, and he has never once told me what to do with a single day of my life, which is the thing I value most about him. The violets in my garden are coming up well this spring. They have always been my favorite flower. I did not entirely understand why until I found a pressed one on a pillow." Alina sat at her desk with the letter and let everything it contained arrive in her fully and without management. She let the gladness and the grief and the complicated weight of 4 years and everything that had happened inside them exist simultaneously, which was the only honest way to hold any of it. Then she wrote back. 5 pages in her clearest hand, telling Clara everything she had not been able to say before, from the beginning to the present morning, holding nothing back. She signed it with her name, her first name, the only name that had always truly been hers. Dr. Elias Hobb received his December money order at the usual time, but this December it arrived with a brief note that said, "With gratitude that cannot be measured. The matter has resolved as well as I dared to hope. Please burn this note. He read the note twice and put it in the small fire in his consulting room and poured himself a glass of brandy, which he rarely did in the evenings, and stood at the window watching the dark fields beyond his surgery. He was very glad. It was the specific, warm, quiet gladness of a person who has done the right thing at considerable personal risk and has lived to learn that it ended well. On the morning after their wedding, Edmund Cavendish walked through the Edinburgh house at 7 o'clock and found the study occupied. Eleanor was at the desk with the lamp burning and the morning case files from the firm open in front of her. Her unnecessary spectacles were on her nose. Her hair was loose and not yet pinned for the day. She had made herself a cup of tea that sat at her elbow going cold. He went to the kitchen. He made tea. He came back to the study and set a fresh cup on the desk beside the cold one. She did not look up from the document she was reading. He looked at her desk in the early Edinburgh morning, reading case files in the lamplight with her unpinned hair and her unnecessary spectacles and her cold tea replaced with hot, and he thought about a drawing room in Bath where he had risen too quickly from a chair to meet a woman who had said "How do you do" in the precise tone of someone who meant not a word of it. He thought about 3 garden walks and one honest exchange in which she had told him there was a difference between not being consulted and not being happy. He thought about a funeral in November, and 4 minutes at a grave and a question he had been carrying forward quietly ever since, without an answer, without any certainty that an answer would come. He thought about a conference room and an envelope, and a woman who had removed a pair of unnecessary spectacles and looked him in the eye, and told the complete truth without apology or hesitation, and without asking permission. He said, "Rise and shine, wife." She looked up then, over the spectacles she did not need, and she laughed. It was a full laugh, the real kind, the kind that does not perform itself for anyone or manage itself for anyone or make any calculation about what anyone watching might think. It came out of her completely and filled the small Edinburgh study and bounced off the book-lined walls, and she put one hand briefly over her face as though surprised by the scale of it, and then she took the hand away and was still laughing. Edmund Cavendish sat down at the desk across from hers. He opened his own papers. They worked in the same room in the early Edinburgh morning, the city beginning its day around them, the baker below already warm and busy, and neither of them said anything further for a long time, which suited them both exactly.